Thank you so very much. That was so beautiful. We really do appreciate your being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
We are going to wait for just a couple minutes because we got one more minute before we officially begin. And so I would love it if you could just stay around for a few minutes so that everybody can meet you. And
absolutely.
so
and maybe
if
it's okay
you.
with Juliana, we can play the third movement one more time.
Oh,
Okay.
excellent. Please. Yes, we love it.
Okay. No worries.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so very much. So I'm just going to welcome everyone to Wayne State School of Social Work. We are very, very proud to have you here. And before we begin the introductions of our keynote speaker, I want to introduce our musicians. The spirit of community scholarship provides financial assistance to clarinetists participating in programs of the Digital Clarinet Academy. And it requires the musicians to share their talents. So I want to just thank our two musicians, Juliana Idle and Emery Friedman, for providing that music to us. The music that they were playing was from Valerie Coleman's Portraits of Langston, written in honor of Langston Hughes and his time as an artist during his European exploration, and particularly of Paris. And so again, we're very, very proud to support these musicians and the work that they're doing, and hope that all of you enjoyed it as well. So Juliana and Emery, thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh,
Big
we're gonna-
applause from all of us. Thank
you
you.
so much. We appreciate it, and we're so happy to be here. And thank you so much for listening. We had no idea. I was looking at the participants, and it's growing, but there's like over 200 people in here, and we had no idea there was going to be that
Yes.
many people. So we're grateful that we were all able to play for you, and thank you so much for having us. And if you ever need any musicians, you know, we're always here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, now you're very well known in Detroit, so thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. We are here in our third of a series of forums regarding issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today's topic is presented by Dr. David Pate. Dr. David Pate, I will call a friend and a colleague. We started our administrative roles together at the same time, and we're in an introductory class with the National Association of Deans and Directors of Social Work. But Dr. Pate is a very busy man. He is the chair and associate professor of at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Helen Bader School of Social Welfare in the Department of Social Work. He's also an affiliated professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies and the university's Honor College, as well as an affiliated associate professor at the Institute of Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Pate's talk today is entitled, "Do Black Men Deserve the American Dream?" And it's a very provocative talk that I hope enlists a lot of questions and discussion as we move forward. Dr. Pate's work has been very important, and I just want to say I appreciate so much that he's had the opportunity to meet with many of you in forums during the day today. So thank you, Dr. Pate, for that. I know that people are very appreciative of your work here. Before we get David Pate to start his talk, I want to say a few words about some housekeeping rules. First of all, anyone who's looking for continuing education credits, or students seeking credit or extra credit for classroom work should sign in the link in the chat. And I know that many of you have already done that. We are requesting that everyone please mute your own microphones. Sometimes they go off and on, but if you can just pay attention to keeping those muted, that would prevent disruptions of the speaker. And finally, we will entertain questions for about the last half hour of the talk. If you have a question, Dr. Johns will be facilitating those questions towards the end. Please type the questions in the chat, and Dr. Johns will ask them towards the end of the session. So without any further ado, I would really like to welcome a warm Detroit welcome to Dr. David Pate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to once again to be able to present to everyone here. The title of my talk today is "Do Black Men Deserve the American Dream? The Impact of Gendered Deservingness on Economic Security for Marginalized Families." Just want to remind you that I'm going to be pretty much doing somewhat of a historical, sociological, and some attention to social welfare policies that I really would like us to think about as we think about how much impact or how much access do we provide to Black men, or to men, period, in the social welfare system. But I wanted to first do do some housekeeping myself. One, I want to wish all those social workers out there a happy Social Work Month.
Thank you.
We really appreciate what you do for us and how you provided services to those who are in need. And as a social worker, my former direct service social worker, I understand the job is not always easy. You don't get enough money, and you're doing the best work. You're doing what many people say is God's work. I want to especially thank Dean Cheryl Kubiak for the invitation. We were supposed to be doing this last year, and I was really disappointed I couldn't come back to Detroit to do that. For those who don't know, I'm a graduate of the University of Detroit. I was a proud Titan, and I was a proud member of a variety of activities I'll mention in a few seconds, but I know Detroit very well and really do miss the opportunity to be there. I also want to thank Betsy Vanderselt and Elizabeth Kennedy for logistics and marketing and kind support in making this happen. And throughout this lecture, you'll see a few photographies of slides of prints of Black men and Black families that were done by Carlos Javier Ortiz, who is a known documentarian throughout the country for his work. And I'll be doing it to kind of give my portrayal, give a look at Black men. I also want to thank the members of the Metro Detroit Fatherhood Policy Work Group and the Children's Center for spending time with me today and telling me about the wonderful work they're doing in the city of Detroit, as well as in the state of Michigan. I would also have to say that I know Wayne State very well. I know the Warriors are a proud team, particularly their football team. And those of you who are former Warriors and members of Wayne State as graduates, welcome today, and it's great to see you. But also, Wayne State was a special place for me as a young man. I had the fortune of meeting really 5 wonderful men. I pledged on the campus of Wayne State. I'm a proud member of Kappa Alpha Psi, the Alpha Beta chapter. And it's hard for me to even think about having this talk without saying hello to them for those who are here, but also to say that I really do look at the issue of manhood and brotherhood and the whole idea of how we all are working together for the betterment of everyone to attain the American dream. That's been a major part of my life in helping me to attain my opportunity to be a part of the American dream. And I also want to acknowledge something that Wayne State did on October 8th, 2018, was to acknowledge that Wayne State sits on the land of the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Wyandot in your city, and that you now celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think that's another one that we want to mention in terms of looking at who deserves the American dream. Even though I'm focusing today on Black men, I think we need to also remember how this country was colonized and where we stand today. I thought I would start out with a little bit of trivia about a Black male slave. And I don't know how many people know this, but I wanted to start out with the name of a person. His name is spelled Onesimus, One Seamus. He's a former enslaved, he was an enslaved man. And the reason I'm talking about him in particular, he's very appropriate for what we're going through in terms of COVID and the vaccination. This was a former enslaved man who invented or introduced the procedures of inoculation, in terms of a vaccine to stop the spread of smallpox during slavery in 1721. His method of inoculation is what we're using today to have us all get treated against COVID. This physician, he was owned by a physician in Boston by the name of Boylston, and Boylston took credit for what the slave had taught him how to do that saved over a half of the population that he owned. And it wasn't until 2016 that this slave got recognition for the fact that he was the one and the reason why we have this method of inoculation. And so when I talk about do Black men deserve the American dream, it's somewhat rhetorical, of course. I believe everyone in this room would say, we believe that Black people deserve and Black men deserve the American dream. But there's been a number of atrocities and issues that have happened in this country that have not allowed entree or opportunities for Black men to attain that. And there's issues of power and fear that have gotten in the way of that. I also, for one other, before I get further into my talk, I want to say their name. I want to say Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, who was shot this summer. I want to say David McAtee, George Floyd, Michael Ramos, Breonna Taylor, Manuel Ellis, and so many others who have unfortunately not had the opportunity to attain the American dream because they were murdered or shot as unarmed people doing what they do, and therefore, unfortunately, did not get that opportunity to do that. So let me get into my talk. Before I do that, let me get into my slides, because I know I need to share those with everybody. I want to make sure you have those to look at. But, of course, my question is, and I'm going to be looking down at my notes, so you may not get my eyes all the time, and I apologize for that. But you'll have the slides to look at, so you won't have to see my eyes very much. But I wanted to start by saying, it's a rhetorical question. It's a rhetorical statement. And the thought is, I would like to have a conversation with you, and really a conversation. And that's why I'm going to be somewhat doing this as if in lecture style with the slides. And I'm looking forward to your questions and answers, your questions afterwards, because I want to have a conversation with you today about where we explore and examine the variety of policies and practices, particularly social policies, and which have enhanced racial inequities particularly as they're looked at through through a lens of race, gender, and class. And whether those consequences were unintended or intended, we need to explore where we stand as a country about the whole idea of providing everyone access to what they deserve, as well as citizenship. If you give me a minute, I'm going to pull up my slides. And there we are. So let me go to the first slide here. So, again, the whole idea of what does it mean to be a man in America is one big question here. And when we look at this from an intersectionality position, which is what I tend to do my research through, I look at the issue of race, class, and gender, and how did we get to a definition of race? How do we view gender? And how do we view class? And what are some of the services that are available to those who are in what services are available depending on whether they meet the issue of race, class, and gender for that particular benefit. Again, photography like this is to a really good friend, Carlos. And I want to again thank him for allowing me to really share his very valuable prints throughout this session. So when we look at the whole issue of race, class, and gender, there used to be systems of power, which is intersectionality. America projects what a man is supposed to be, but they cut Black men out of it is something that Ta-Nehisi Coates said, and I had read in preparation for this talk. I have to say, I've never prepared a year for a talk. So not to say it's going to be very organized and very polished, but I have read more books, listened to more lectures, went to more bookstores that were open during COVID just to sit down, or and library, gotten more books out to really, how did we get to this place where we define manhood, where we define masculinity, how we define gender, and how we came to this place of who was deserving and undeserving. These three fundamental systems of power, among many others, like education and expression and sexual orientation, are so significant, and they influence many of the things that we do. Even if you may not think of it that way, as an academic, I tend to really think about how do these three interact with each other, but also how do we decide based on just gender, based on just class, based on just race, how do people get access to whatever is available to them? This photography you see here is something I took when I went to the museum that's in Birmingham that honors all of those who have been lynched in this country, which is, again, we'll talk about later about lynching. But again, lynching was another one of those fear tactics that were put out there to say that if you try to show more who you are and think that you're my equal, we have ways of just letting you know that you're not. And within that particular idea of race, class, and gender, it's very grounded in history. One of the things that America does not do a very good job of, and I know it through my own students, is that we don't really talk about the full breadth of what the history is about America and what does that mean. And when we talk about Black history is American history. Black history is anything that I talk about related to who I am or someone who looks like me. I have to say it's American history, and we have to remember that. One thing I just remembered, I looked down at my notes, I forgot to thank Dr. John too in advance for taking the question and answer period. So I didn't want to not give them a shout out as well. The other thing about this is that when you look at how we are grounded in history around race, class, and gender, this talk is really around, and I want you to really remember this through all the conversation I had with you. What do we mean when we say someone is deserving, and what does deservingness means? And in looking at the dictionary, it's really simple. It's the quality of being deserving assistance. Now, when you think about manhood, men are generally not seen as someone who is deserving of any assistance, because manhood has been crafted in a way by those who were white, because they were the ones who came over and colonized this country, in terms of you being independent, of not needing help, of brushing off pain. And I was talking to someone earlier today, I said the whole thing about men's healthcare, unfortunately, is that many men are not healthy unless they're married or partnered. Many men do not take care of themselves because they don't feel that they should be going to the doctors. Or in the case of many of the men that I study who tend to make less than $12,000 a year, they don't have the healthcare access. And I'm in a state, unlike Michigan, where we don't have an expanded Medicaid program. Our current governor is trying to get that, but our previous governor did not feel we needed to take the money from the Obama administration because just for political reasons. So therefore, when you look at those type of decisions made for political reasons, who is harmed? And generally it's people who don't have children, and it's people who are single adults, and that's men and women. And oftentimes a lot of those are men who just don't have any resources at all. when we think about the American dream, that's a whole nother concept that is, this talk is about. And all of you, like myself, had an idea what the American dream was. I remember as a kid, it was the Brady Bunch, that you had a house, your mom and dad had a, your mom stayed home, your dad worked. And the unfortunate part of that is my role model, or my thought of what the American dream was a white person who had a house. Unfortunately, black children my age, when I was a black child, now that I'm an adult, but when I was a child, my view of who was successful, unfortunately, there was very few images that I could look at who was successful. Now, I did see images of someone like some people on Good Times, and I saw Red Fox on Sanford and Son, and I also saw a movie called Claudine. They were all various images of people I didn't know, and people who lived in my neighborhood or lived close by me or were family members. But I never saw anyone beyond that on TV, or I may have seen them on TV. I was very happy. I can still remember the time as a kid when I saw the Supremes on TV and the Temptations. And I was so amazed at seeing these Black people on TV. And people don't think that means a lot, but it does mean a lot because I can remember it so vividly when it occurred. So again, the American dream for many of us is it's a way of living, and and we're told from the moment we're born, if you work hard, which is generally referred to as meritocracy, you will be able to get everything you need. Just work hard, and you'll be successful. You'll get a good job. You'll have a nice house. You may have a couple of kids, and you'll have plenty of money. And that's just not how it is for everybody. But when Americans think of the American dream, it's mainly having personal freedom, which is a big deal for so many of us. Having your basic needs met, achieving your potential, having enough free time, having time where you can do what you want. Go to the movies, go to the Bahamas, go to Europe, go wherever. Not right now, of course, but very soon, many of us will be able to do that again. But it really is that you have the opportunity to make choices. And one of the things that a good friend of mine said yesterday in the talk, Derek Hamilton, has said, without any wealth, you never will have personal freedom. Without any kind of income, you can't have personal freedom. And that's a reality that is so true. And I often think about that with so many of the men that I talk to in my research. The other thing I'll say before we get into more of the details of my talk is that we have to look at what historical trauma has been perpetuated to people whom do not look like us necessarily, but who are living in this country and have had some different life experiences than other people, particularly those who are Black and brown. They've had different life experiences. And to deny the whole idea that the trauma that your parents or your grandparents or their parents have felt doesn't sometimes translate or possibly translate to you as an adult is not real. And also because certain people may even believe that that's who you are and reinforce whatever they've had of thoughts of you as and whatever those stereotypes may be, that historical trauma does carry through. And so I think that for those who are Native and Indigenous, this particular term came from their life experience of being colonized. And as I always think about it when I teach my students, just imagine you're at home, I walk in your house, and I say, get out, this is mine now. You've paid it off, who cares? This is mine now. It's just that same type of idea that space that you've been on or space that you've nurtured, space that has been your sanctuary has been taken from you, or that the humanness that you've experienced is now minimized and you no longer are worthy or have privilege to have that anymore. This type of historical trauma is documented well in many medical journals. They see it in people's DNA. And it's something to be considered. So again, historical trauma has its own place in this discussion as well. And I wanted to bring that up as another concept. So let's start with the social work world that I'm in. So in the social work world that I'm in, and in my policy discussions with my students, and now with you, I want to talk about this issue of deserving and undeserving. And how is that applied even today? In 1601, in the Elizabethan Poor Laws in England, they had decided due to sense of poverty and the need to take care of people who were not in the place of being well off, they decided that they needed to make some distinctions. So those who were deserving were defined as those who were women and children, those who were disabled, and those who were elderly. And those who were undeserving were those who had drug and alcohol problems, those who refused to work, and adult men. When we look at our country 410 years later, and these were the people who were living under this system came and colonized this country, they brought with them these same philosophical ideas of who was deserving and undeserving. Because in our social welfare system, we still use these to designate who has access to social welfare policy and who doesn't. So the whole idea of deservingness is very much within the fabric, within the soil of our country. And we often have, and I often find myself figuring out, not figuring out, but catching myself in terms of my own um, stereotype or disdain or anger, I don't know what it might be, about who's deserving and undeserving. And I'm someone who's very much a social justice warrior, so very much someone who believes in feminist thought, someone who really thinks that the world could be a better place if we all did our part. But again, because we all are in a system that does perpetuate a deserving and undeserving group, and reciprocity is something we all, not all, but many of us believe in because that's the way we are trained and raised. This is a real issue. And so therefore, I would like you to think about when I'm talking, how is deserving and undeserving perpetuated, particularly when it pertains to men, and then adding that other layer of race, Black men, what has been done to show whether to either support or ignore whether or not they're worthy of full citizenship and worthy of their rights as a member of society. The 1619 project that I don't know how many of you are aware of, but it was a wonderful project out of the New York Times. And if you haven't had access to it, I would highly recommend you read it. 1619 pertains to when the White Lion dropped anchor on the eastern shore of North America. A British colony called Virginia was welcoming this ship, this pirate ship. They had 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. And that's when America was not America until those people stepped on that soil. It was at that point America defined who it was going to be. It was at that point we defined what Blackness meant and what whiteness meant as well. The social construction of race began in those ships carrying human cargo for labor, but the first documented court case of acknowledging white and Black people was in 1630. But before I talk about that case, I wanted to bring up a quote that I read that was very interesting from Brian Stevenson, who I know many of you know through his work in Birmingham. One, he references that when we looked at whites in the early 1600s, they were referred to as Christians, and anyone Black was referred to as a heathen. That's well documented in terms of how we looked at who was deserving and who was undeserving. But also Brian Stevenson kind of supports what Nicole Hannah Jones talks about in the 1619 project. The whole narrative of white supremacy was created during the era of slavery. It was a necessary theory to make white Christian people feel comfortable with their ownership of other human beings, and we created a narrative of racial difference in this country to sustain slavery. And even people who didn't own slaves brought into that narrative, included people in the North. And I want us to remember that it wasn't just people in the South who were getting benefit from the whole idea of white supremacy and that we said one race was more superior than another. It was the fact that it benefited everybody, and those in the North and the South were a part of that. And as I mentioned earlier, this young man who owned this slave in Boston and then took credit for his training him of how they inoculated people in Africa was what we use today as part of our work to get COVID to this moment. And I want to mention a Black woman was the one who invented the COVID inoculation that we're getting now. She was the first one to discover that. But let's talk about a man named Hugh Davis. And Hugh Davis in 1630 was whipped in front of an assembled audience of Black and white Virginians to show everyone what the punishment would be for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and shame of Christians by defiling his body and lying with a Negro. And what happened was Hugo Davis decided to have intimate relations with a Black enslaved woman. And what they decided in 1630 was, how dare you disgust yourself or lower your standards to sleep with this Black non-human. And therefore that we needed to make you an example of everybody. So therefore we're going to whip you in front of Black and white people to let you know that that's unacceptable in this country. This whipping This whipping is something that's recorded in history as one of the most important concepts of race in America, the exclusiveness, the exclusivity of whiteness and what whiteness means. This idea of white purity ensured that Blackness could hardly benefit socially, politically, or financially from proximity to whiteness in any meaningful way. And I got this out of the book. If you haven't read a book, I'm gonna recommend this, 400 Souls. This book is is unbelievably good. If you don't know history of Black people, this book is pretty thick, but I read this book in 2 days by listening to what was read. It's just nonstop, interesting reading. Now, of course, I'm an academic and you can say he's just nerdy, but I really do recommend it to everybody. If you don't know history and American history in terms of how Black people were a part of it, this is the book that I'd highly recommend. Another important part of what makes us very interesting was this whole idea of this social construction of race. Because if you have the opportunity like I've had to travel pretty much throughout the world, people do not go by Black and white. They generally go by their designation as African, and I'm an African who's an Egyptian, or I'm an African who's Tanzanian, or I'm French, or I'm Austrian. But in America, we go by Black and white. You know, you may say your ethnicity is something different, but we tend to go by Black and white. So this whole idea of race is definitely a construction that was created for the purpose of saying that one group was more superior than the other. The other thing about, and with that said, America was slavery, and that's something you always hear. America, though slavery was very different, because there's slavery codified in law that people could be sold like painting tools, farming tools, mining tools, pigs, cows, hogs. And this is an example of a banner that was used to promote the sale of slaves. Young Black males sold for more money because of their labor and their strength, and the fact that they could help to reproduce, which some men were used for the purpose of helping to reproduce, often referred to as a young buck. Those are real. And so when you start thinking about how do I construct my gender, how has my race been constructed, those legal actions make a big difference. So chattel slavery meant that you were not human in America, and that was codified in federal law. And it was first codified in 1661, 1647, and then different states brought into it, so that so anybody who was a slave, who was brought over as an enslaved person, this was their reality. It was in 1661 that we had our first anti-missegregation statute prohibiting marriages between races, because that was seen as definitely wrong and illegal. Also, the whole idea in America that we codified was to make sure that those babies that were born of a white father, because of rape and other things that happened, that America made it so that if this baby was born to a Black woman and came out looking fairly white, it didn't matter whether the baby had a white father. If the mother's status was a slave, then the child's status was a slave. And the owner owned both of those children, owned the child and the mother. But where England's common law, the father's status was what determined that. So this father's status was used for the white, and the mother's status was used for those who were Black, for the most part. Also, people were legally barred. If you were an enslaved person, you couldn't marry, you couldn't learn to read, you couldn't have private meetings, you couldn't go and say at night when your master was asleep, you couldn't have these gatherings, because if you did, you could be killed, you could be whipped, you could lose a foot. It was a variety of ways. Your children were not yours, they could be sold at any time. You had no legal standing. You could be raped or murdered with no legal consequences, because you were not human, and you didn't own, and you couldn't own property. So therefore you were just this thing walking around. And unfortunately at that time, cats and dogs and animals had much more, owners had much more of a stance than a person who was an enslaved person. So people had to witness their child being sold. People had to witness their partner, whether it's a man or woman, being raped or sold or beaten for no reason other than I just don't like you today, or I'm mad at you, or you're going to make me more money if you go somewhere else. And that's how people got their property, got their profits. you know, what's interesting at that time, and this is Thomas Jefferson, I'm sure you know Jefferson, you know, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and in that declaration, he talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it was a very trying time for some people, not for others. But Jefferson was the one president of ours who had the most slaves of any president. If you know Jefferson's life, you know he had Sally Hemings, and he had many children with the slave woman Sally Hemings. In fact, one of his children lived in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm living at. And you can see and the grave site of where he's buried at mentions his father and mother on the tombstone. When he came to Madison, Wisconsin, he came pretending he was a white man, because at that time, if you had a drop of black blood in you, you were considered black if they were able to trace that, and you had no rights to serving as in the position or the agency of being a man. So therefore, when Jefferson wrote this, he even did write in the Declaration of Independence that he wanted to say something about slavery, but it didn't pass. They took that paragraph out of there. So again, in looking at our country's involvement in it, they were very involved. The Constitution of the United States had 84 clauses that approved of how slavery was to be handled, that approved that you could sell people, that approved that we could have a slave trade. 6 of those clauses dealt directly with enslavement, and 5 more implications for slavery. The Constitution protected the property of those who enslaved people. It prohibited the federal government from intervening and ending the deportation of slavery as well. So when you look at how people are deserving and undeserving, it's not just I'm saying you're not deserving. It's the government that you live under is saying that you as an individual here, even though you're very much involved in making this country who it is, you are undeserving of any type of benefits to what we ascribe as your manhood or your personhood. One of the other, so as we get further along and slavery is now almost coming to an end, there was because some people were the slave trade had ended, the legal slave trade had ended in 1808, but that didn't mean they couldn't do other ways of attaining more slaves. That's when the whole idea of these ideas of having baby making factories, where the job of a slave woman was to make as many babies as she could, and the job of some of the men was to be engaged in that production. And they actually had set up systems just for that. So from 1808 until the end of slavery, the slave population just grew immensely, just because there were people here who could reproduce. And just like they reproduced for their cows and chickens, they were reproducing these people for their labor. And their labor was building America. One of the things that would happen, so some people were able to buy their freedom. Some people were able to escape and go to other states. But the Dred Scott decision that was done in 1857 was one of those decisions that said the Negro race, the court rule, was a separate class of people. They weren't like the white people. And therefore, that particular decision decided that Negroes did not have the same rights of citizenship under the Constitution, where that if you're born here and your mother wasn't a slave, then you're not. But if you look like a slave, because we do also look at people and decide who they are, then you don't have that right. If someone sees you in another place, we can still just take you back to your previous slave owner, even though you may be free, or take you to another slave owner or sell you to someone else. So the Dred Scott decision further solidified what it meant to be Black in America, what it meant to be male in America, and therefore compromise who they can be as time went on. Another very interesting way of looking at how agencies described by class, race, and gender. The only people in America at the time this was going on who could own property, could own a home, who made decisions about money were men. And enslaved men saw their white counterparts acting and behaving in a certain way. Therefore, they of course I would think, this is how I should act, this is how I should behave. However, they weren't given the same privilege. And one of the major privileges, and you heard this from a previous speaker in this series, who's a good friend of mine, Trina Shanks, about the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act, and she has an article which is here, which is a seminal article, which is being widely quoted right now, and referenced around the whole idea that people in January of 1863, any US citizen who has never taken up arms against the United States could claim up 160 acres of land. And only men could do that. Now women could do it too, but There was very few women who really would take advantage of that, but it was primarily men. Now that didn't include black men, but if you found some land and you lived on it for 5 years and you paid $18, which would now be $468 with inflation, you had that land to pass on to your family. You had that land to pass on wealth that would be taking you into a whole nother place where it could be your second home or your third home or whatever. But land is money in this country. Land allows you to send your kids to college, refinance your house, to pay your medical bills if they get out of hand, to do a lot of the refinance. You could do many things with land. But because one group was able to do that and another group still was not able to do that, even though they said in the law that once slavery's over, you can try to do this. So they didn't know that for sure. The people became eligible, but based on a variety of black codes and other things, such as something called lynching and other terrorist activities, not many black people were able to take advantage of that. And again, there's another good book I would recommend you read, and that's by Darity and Mullen on reparations, that talks a lot about this whole idea of the Homestead Act and also what 40 acres and a mule meant during that time, which I have to admit, in my own ignorance, I never really took 40 acres and a mule as real. I thought it was this kind of folklore thing that we should kind of jokingly get, but that was real, that we were guaranteed or told we should be able to get 40 acres and a mule. And of course, it never happened for everybody. It happened for a small group of people, but for many black men, it did not happen. Now we get to a point where the Civil War, and we've decided that slavery is wrong. The Emancipation Proclamation has been read. That doesn't mean slavery was legally over. It just meant that Lincoln has said we need to stop slavery. It's done. No more of this. The South, let the people go. And we went through this period called Reconstruction, which was that one opportunity where we could actually see that you could determine the legal status of former Africans enslaved people and their ability to attain equity. This was the Reconstruction era also redefined our US citizenship. It expanded the franchise and relationship between the federal government and the governments of the state. It highlighted the differences between political and economic democracy in ways that if there was going to be a time when Black enslaved people could be actually at least moving towards equity with their counterparts, this was the opportunity to really do that. President Andrew Johnson attempted to return the southern states to where they were. He was the one who somewhat did not like this whole idea of African Americans attaining full US citizenship. So therefore, some of the things that was started did not go all the way through. Again, we had people who were very uncomfortable with that. But the one thing about this particular time that's really important for social work anyway, is that the very first social welfare program was directed at enslaved Black people. And that was called the Freedmen's Act, or more importantly, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands in March of 1865. So it's really interesting that we're having this talk in March, but that's when the whole idea of manhood and personhood and citizenship opportunity was given so many years ago to say that we are now going to recognize you as full citizens. And this particular agency was mandated to provide programs to former rebellious states, because that's where the majority of slaves were, and to give them opportunities to have access to food, healthcare, educational programs, and legal services. So when you think about the fact that they were saying that former enslaved people should be able to Black codes were put up that were definitely harming those who were Black. Lynchings were starting to occur as a method of fear. And some scholars even have argued that legal rationalizations, extra legal violence, and everyday racial terror, further widening the racial divide among Blacks and whites. Others have pointed out that the end of the war left Black Americans free, but their status undetermined, with the passing of codes to prevent Black people from being truly free. because people just could not handle, and they were fearful of losing the power they had. And this is where the whole idea of power comes in. When you have power over hundreds of thousands of people, and now they're just free, and they're talking to you as if we're on the same level, that messes with people's minds. That messes with people's intellect. And I would even argue that what we're seeing today, or what we've seen in the last 4 years, and even today, is some of that same concern, because our country in 2042 will be more brown than it is white, and that's something that people don't have to tend with. One of the places where we saw some of the major growth of Black agency was in South Carolina. And at one point, right after the Civil War, South Carolina was the one state where over 50% of all the people in Congress for that state were Black. It was also where many of our first Black, or as they were called, colored senators and representatives came from. I always am very happy to see this picture from 1872 of the very first Black major House of Representatives and Senators. Hiram Revels and several others were there. And they were making decisions, and that made people very nervous. And in making people very nervous, it also, what else made them nervous was that there was 3 amendments, and Black people are the only people in this country who have amendments that are supposed to guarantee citizenship for everybody. And that's why when you hear the whole idea of Blacks were very engaged in creating the democracy that is considered America, is because the 13th Amendment says nobody can be a slave in this country anymore, which is a constitutional amendment. The 14th Amendment says anyone born in America on American soil, whether that's on a ship that's owned by the Air Force or the Army or Navy, whether you're in Germany on that land and you're on an American base, or whether you're in the domestic lands of Hawaii, Alaska, and the continental USA, you are an American citizen. And the last amendment, which is the 15th Amendment, gave Black men the right to vote. And this all happened during Reconstruction. So they're getting the right to vote, they're getting the right to be called citizens. So now when their children are born to them, they are an American without question. And no one can be a slave. It's totally illegal. Except, and that's something we'll talk about later too, or we can bring it up in discussion, you can be put back into slavery if you're incarcerated. That's in the 13th Amendment. So when you look at who's incarcerated, lots of Black men are incarcerated. Lots of Black men are incarcerated. And lots of Black men who are incarcerated. In Wisconsin, 50% of our prison system or correction system is Black males. But in Wisconsin, there's only 7% Black people in the whole state, but they're 50% of our correction system. And people in jail or more prisons, they make furniture. They used to at one time raise farms for Whole Foods, groceries in terms of the vegetables. They do a lot of things. They make jeans. They do a lot of things that they're not getting paid the same wage as they would get paid if they were not in jail. But again, it makes me wonder what's going on here with this 13th Amendment and the rise of incarceration, and particularly this focus on Black men. The one thing I wanted to bring back too was this whole idea of 40 acres and a mule, where 40 acres were promised. 400,000 people were able to get some advantage of that. That was worth about $6 trillion. It was a special order number 15. That special order though only went so far because people were really not having this whole idea that Black people could have land and be on equal footing with them. So we have a social construction of race, but the legal construction of race became a reality in 1896, when it was said that Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was on the train, minding his business. He decided to sit in the car that was labeled for whites only. So, and if you saw Plessy looked like, he did appear as someone, if you just looked at him, as as white. But someone knew that he had a Black mother who was on the train, and they told the train person that he was Black. And so the whole idea of the 1 drop of blood rule and the whole idea of segregation was legalized in this country in 1896. So the whole idea of separate but equal became a reality, and that wasn't challenged again until 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in the Supreme Court. But the separate but equal now was further allowing to say that we'll have separate facilities for you, but they don't have to be, of course, the same quality, but they are a facility. So you'll have a separate bathroom, you have a separate entrance to go into the theater, you have a separate place to sit on the bus. That's legal, but we'll give you the same thing that we all get, but it's just going to be separate. And again, if you think about a person's consciousness of who they are as a human, who they are as a man, who they are as a person, this is going to mess with you as well, because you're being reminded you're not as good as me. You're being reminded you cannot attain the same status as me based on how we view you. At the same time also, and I'm sure Dr. Kubiak has heard about this one, Race, Traits, and the Tendencies of the American Negro came out that exact same year, which is the most influential race and crime study of the first half of the 20th century. This particular study was talked about in the book by Khalil Mohammed and the Condemnation of Blackness, where they talked about Black people can never be truly trusted. They have criminal tendencies that are in their body, in their person. And that particular text and manuscript has been one of the most influential texts on looking at how you view Black males, but Black people as people who you just can't trust. They're criminals. And so with the federal rule around Plessy v. Ferguson, the idea that now Reconstruction is over and we're going to destroy whatever you thought you were going to have because we still have power, even though it may not be done in the way that it was. Maybe you may not be a slave, but also at the same time, if you were unemployed, that was considered that you were a vagrant and that you could be put in jail for being unemployed. You were seen as a vagrant. And that was a standard rule in the South for sure. And that was something that they did practice, that had happened. And one of the things that they did was, and this is an example of a group of young men where they reinstituted this whole amendment of bringing back slavery, but these young men, for example, may have just been walking the streets and not working that day, or maybe they looked at a white person and they shouldn't have looked at a white person. So now, because they violated whatever the ruling was, and these rulings were very arbitrary, just very, very arbitrary. So it's either you would do this or they would lynch you. But again, and the lynching was a message. It was a message to say that for the Black community, that your boundaries of citizenship, we still have control over that. We still have an idea. We still can make you do what we want you to do. So therefore, this is some of the examples of where you have, it was slavery by another name. And there's a really valuable book on that if you want to read about it. But once slavery was over, this was the new way of dealing with men. Another very interesting way of how manhood was challenged and manhood was compromised was this Black boxer here. And for those who are sports people, this is Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the very first Black heavyweight champion of the world in 1910. At the same time, he was also someone who was very much loved by a lot of people. And he was someone who was very proud to flaunt his mink coats and all of his other wonderful garb. But he was also someone who only dated white women in 1910. And he was accused of a woman he was very much in love with and who loved him. He was accused of committing what was called white slavery. And because the woman was taken across state lines against her own will, even though she said she was not, she was with this man voluntarily. And so the federal government created the Mann Act to say that any Black man, because we know he is hypersexualized, he loves white women, and he's going to do whatever he can to destroy the race. Now we can now imprison them for that. And he won, and also because of the fact he was the first Black man and the first real sports figure to be the champion of the world. White men were challenged by that. They were fearful of this Black man as he presented himself as being someone who would take over their position of being the leader, the ruler, however you want to say that. So the Mann Act was created in 1910. And on top of that, a movie called The Birth of a Nation came out. And if you hadn't seen The Birth of a Nation, another way of continuing the stereotypical codification of Black people are not to be trusted. In that film is all about Black men raping white women, Black men in Congress picking their toes and picking their nose and drinking liquor and doing other kind of horrible things that were not true. It also was a film that was supported by Woodrow Wilson as the best film and the most critical film of our time, with the full truths that it offers. So, and also this, I need to go back to Reconstruction about another president, which I just remembered. I didn't write in my notes. But the other thing about this time was that the reason Reconstruction also ended, and this movement to really dehumanize Black people, particularly Black men, because Black manhood means power, was that he agreed as president, who at one point was on the other side of those who opposed slavery, if those who were in favor of slavery and keeping those who were Black and formerly enslaved in a position of being more subservient, they would give him his votes. He decided to end Reconstruction, to end Freedmen's Bureau for the purposes of being president, and it's well documented. And there's a series on Reconstruction through PBS. If you don't know a lot about Reconstruction, there's the four-part series, and it's a series that I even require in my social welfare policy class, because many of the ways that we look at poor people, because welfare for me, and as I will say, and I stand by it, welfare and any other kind of ill is generally related to Blackness in this country. And so when people hear welfare, they don't generally think of the white person. They generally think of the Black person, because of so much of the media and the literature and also the dialogue that has been done around looking at those who are in welfare has been connected to those who are Black. So this film in 1915, which is one of the most watched films of all time, it also solidified people's thoughts about Black people and whether or not they were worthy of the same benefits of those who were white. We get to the Social Security Act in 1935, which is really about who is deserving and undeserving, and reinforces who is deserving and undeserving. And the Social Security Act has two categories: social insurance, public assistance. Those who work have some benefits that are very different from those who don't work or can't work, or due to some kind of financial or other disability or impediment that doesn't allow them to work for a given time. Now, I should mention, and I heard this again yesterday through my colleague and friend Derek Hamilton, the Social Security program was not created for Black people. It was created for white women whose husbands had died in the war. And because of that, they wanted to be sure that those women had some benefits that would allow them to raise their children, but also to be able to, if they could not go to work for some period of time, to have something that allowed them to feed their kids, and to do other things that we think are important because of how we look at women versus men in a patriarchal society. But Black women and Black men who should have been eligible for this benefit were domestic workers. And if you were a domestic worker, you generally weren't getting a check. Maybe you were being paid in cash. And if you were having a check, it wasn't a check through the system where they were taking taxes out. But also people who were Black women in particular, who were the only ones really available to these benefits, particularly on the public assistance side. They had to fight for the right, because Black women were also viewed as hypersexualized, and as not and if they had a child who was out of wedlock, they were treated very differently. Even though at the time Black women were getting married, Black men and women were getting married at rates just as high or higher than white families. But you don't hear about those statistics. But if you read someone like a William Julius Wilson or other sociologists in our country, or historians, you'll hear about that. So therefore, these policies are definitely good and needed. I mean, they could be better, but they were not available to those who were single men, single women. Most of these you couldn't get, except for food stamps. And that wasn't really there at the time. The food stamps didn't come till later, but it was one of those benefits we do have. And then white men could get some of these benefits if they worked, of course, unemployment and workers' comp, Social Security retirement benefit. The very first check for Social Security came to a woman in Madison, Wisconsin, because Social Security was created in Wisconsin. Unemployment insurance was created in Wisconsin. Workers' comp was created in Wisconsin, because many of the people who came here brought with them German social welfare policy traits, ideals that was translated to the state. So Wisconsin is very proud of the fact that it created a lot of the things that we see that are important for the whole country. After World War II, there was also another benefit that was created, which Detroit is very well known for, and that was the Federal Housing Authority. The Federal Housing Administration provided this wonderful thing for GIs to be able to get these very low loans so they can have homes, and you can have and you can start creating something called the suburbs in this country. Now, of course, many of the men who came back from the war who were Black were denied this benefit because they were not seen as someone who was deserving. They weren't able to even get the educational benefits. One of the things that were happening at the same time, many Black fraternities and sororities were starting to come into play. And many of the people who were graduating from college were members of fraternities and sororities because they need to have that social network. But also they were going to schools that were predominantly Black schools because those were the schools that would accept them in a way that so they can get an education and to be able to provide their family some of the same benefits that they saw their white counterparts do. But some of them were doing that through working multiple jobs because they weren't getting the benefits, and some of them were, but many of them weren't. One of the things that Detroit's very well known for is the wall. And this is known by Rothstein, who talks about the underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration said that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. In one development in Detroit, the FHA would not go ahead during World War II with its development unless the developer built a 6-foot high wall, 6-foot high cement wall separating his development from a nearby African American neighborhood to make sure that no African Americans could even walk into that neighborhood. So when we look at race as a factor here, race often will trump gender and class. Because I was saying to a group earlier, when I walk down the street, people don't see Dr. David Pate. They see Black man walking down the street with a hoodie on, or Black man walking down the street with a baseball cap on. And that's the reality for Black men, Black women, Black children, that there's a difference of how we present ourselves. And this talk is focused more on Black men, but that's the reality of the issue of the perpetuation of fear and the perpetuation of unknowing and the stereotypes that have been played out throughout our country's history. A group of people in this country have been able to, since the Mayflower came out, many of you may not have heard about the White Lion that I talked about, which is where the Black people came on, but I'm sure all of you know about the Mayflower. I knew about the Mayflower, but I didn't know about the White Lion, unfortunately, until a couple of years ago, as to when enslaved people came over. So when you have a group of people who have had the opportunity to be able to, for example, accumulate wealth over a 400 plus time period, and then you have another group of people who's try to accumulate wealth and they've only had really about 100 or so years to do it. It's a very different look. It's a very different position that you have. And one of the things that this country has done is that we collected data on who's poor in this country, and we may not believe it, but the numbers are there. Black people in 1959, half of all Black people or more were poor. And poor means that you earned a certain amount of money. And poor, of course, in all of our heads, we have a concept of what poor means. But the federal government defines poor right now. If you are a single adult with no children and you make about $12,500, $502 to say, you're not poor in this country. That's how we define poverty for a single adult with no children. And if you're a family of 4 and you make let's say $26,000, you're not considered poor in this country. If you make less than whatever the federal guideline states, then you're poor. But historically, Black people have always been the poorest group of any group, except for Native Americans or indigenous people in this country. And we don't have good data on them because they're a sovereign state. They tend to keep most of their own data. Some of that data comes in, but they generally are the poorest of anybody. But Black people, of the data we do have, shows historically that when you have all these things that have happened to you federally and through different states, and you consistently are doing something to hold people down, and you generally provide services through men, and the men who are of a certain race are not given that same opportunity as their counterparts, their American dream is compromised. And I often think of the fact that it's amazing to see where we are, where Black people even are. If you look at median income, is another, we've only recently started gathering data on Asians, but again, Blacks historically have always had what is considered not the average amount of income, but they have had the least amount. A median means like the numbers, if you I took every Black person in the country, or every white person, or every Latino, so for this one, if I took every Black and I looked at where income was, and I looked in the exact middle, that's the median income that we're looking at here. And so Black people, as you can see, historically, are trying to play catch up. They're nowhere near the person who colonized this country, and those who have descendants who colonized this country, and those who are Asian are therefore also are really just at leaps and bounds. And again, that could be attributed to where we're seeing some of the Asian hate that's going on in our country. That people are, one, they're upset about COVID, but they're doing so well. And the group that's not doing the best, and they previously were those who identified as white. So again, just something to think about. What drives these rates of between difference between blacks and whites? And I'm saying blacks and whites in general because blacks and whites can be people who don't necessarily who don't identify as white, but who appear white can also be someone who gets that designation. But if you look at how education is provided to those who live in certain neighborhoods, if you have a good tax base, you generally have good schools. In places like Milwaukee, which is often referred to as the most segregated city in the country, and I definitely believe that based on my research in Milwaukee. There's places you can go, you can be just across the street, and it's a whole different look between just a block in cities like Milwaukee and in Detroit as well, which I'm very familiar with. Family structure is an issue, not because the father's not around. That is a reason, but it's because when there's a family and there's two parents, however that that family is composed or is made. I'm not sure. I can't figure out the right word here. However that family is looks, whether it's two women or two men or a man and a woman or grandma and grandpa and the mother, the more people you have around, the more income likely is going to be in that house. So therefore, structure makes a difference around just the economic well-being of families. Unfortunately, some families have less men present for whatever reason, and some families have more men. And I say men because we still have a glass ceiling for women. Women are still paid in unequal ways. Women's labor is not valued in the same way as men's. And if you added race issue on top of that, just if you look at men and women, is that issue. But when you add race on top of that, then there's another issue. And black men's labor and black women's labor is not valued the same way. And that's even between black men and black women. Black men still tend to get more, but it depends which black men you're talking about, because some black men don't make as much based on a variety of issues and who people feel more comfortable with giving a job. Unfortunately, with incarceration, as Brian Stevenson also says, at the beginning of the 21st century, we were at the first time where 1 in 3 black males born in this country were destined for jail or prison because we think that race makes you presumptively dangerous and guilty, no matter what. Again, this is the topic again. I'm not going to get into Dean Kubiak's area. That's what she knows way better than me. So I don't want to be going into her area. But also white families have had significant more time to pass wealth from generation to generation. The typical black family now has about 6 cents for every dollar in wealth held by the typical white family. Black families whose heads, or that's being head of household, graduates from college, has about 33% less wealth than the white families whose head dropped out of high school. Now I want to repeat that. So I'm a black male, I go to college, I'm told that if I go to college, I'll be more successful and I'll have more benefit, more income, more wealth than my counterparts who didn't go. But there's data that, if you don't believe me, please send me an email and I'll send it to you. There's data that shows white high school dropouts do better than black college graduates, with wealth, not income. Wealth means you have less debt, you own property, you have access to other benefits. The other thing is that these findings reinforce that black families, despite precarious financial situations, are committed to educating their children. A study that I read just the other day in preparation for this talk talked about the fact that there are more black students in graduate school disproportionately than whites, because black students know, or black people know, I have to prove myself 2 times more than a white counterpart. So I need to have that graduate degree, even though my counterpart may only need that bachelor's degree. And my social networks are going to be somewhat more compromised because I don't have the historical network that my white counterpart has. I don't have the same access to job security that my white counterpart has. And also, oftentimes, those first Black students, or even whites too, but and with the focus on Black today, when you're the first person in your family to go to college and you do arrive, you often are the person who everyone comes to for assistance, because unfortunately people are still catching hell, for lack of, I'm sorry to use that word, but people are catching hell, and they need to be bailed out of jail. They need to pay their loan. They need to pay their car payment. I need to feed my kids. And I'm just wondering if you can give me $15 until I get paid again, or until I get a job. And that's the reality. There's also more studies that show that place makes a big difference. And if you were to look at this chart, this is from an economist named Ray Chetty. And Ray Chetty talks about the fact that the one thing that we have to really think about now is that Black kids are still being hurt. They're being hurt because men like myself, who are fairly middle class, living a decent life, raising their kids in neighborhoods where the tax base is high and good, the schools are good, we're finding that those same Black boys compared to white boys are still at the bottom of the pyramid, not pyramid, the bottom of the scale here. So this I'm gonna throw out a random number. I'm not sure if this is the right number, but say for example, those same families are making about $200,000 a year, both white and Black. And you expect those kids to go to college or to do something that's going to perpetuate what you, or continue what you've started. They are finding those Black boys are still, the numbers are much higher, and that they will still be in the category of being poor, which means that they're making less, much less than their father or mother. And the economists are really studying this now. What's going on? We tell people to do all these things, but it's really lends itself not to a necessarily behavioral issue, but what's the structure doing that's not allowing them to have the same advantages that their counterparts have when they're getting the same education, they're having the same opportunities, but they're still not being able to attain the same level as their counterparts, which is real. Okay, getting to the end. One last thing, some of the closing statements. There was a major study done around the issue of debt, and particularly how debt within Black communities is often very high, but also how collection agencies really go after those who are in Black neighborhoods more than they go after people who are in white neighborhoods, because they know that there's not, people can't people can't really go places because they don't have much mobility. But there's articles and information around hospitals, utilities, auto and high cost lenders who really put the screws to people who are in neighborhoods of color, in communities where people have very high populations, or who are Black. In those Black neighborhoods in particular, you'll see those payday lenders. And I know in Wisconsin, for example, our payday lending, I don't know about Michigan, which I didn't have a chance to look up, but I know our payday lenders will charge interest rates as high as 500% on just if you get a $100 loan, you're going to owe back $500 by the time you pay it off, or when you come back to pay it off, because the interest is so high. It used to be 1,300%, and there was a lot of movement to get it down. They thought 500 was really good. So payday lenders in our state, unfortunately, do harm families, and those exist everywhere. So what is social services for men? And this is where I really have a pet peeve with social workers. So I'm sure you guys will be ready for me in the question and answer section. But the one thing I'm very disappointed in is that we don't talk about the lack of, or what services we offer to men in social work. And often we don't talk about people's own implicit bias and race and comfort with race in social work. I know that my students in my own class are often even nervous to say to me the word Black, because they think it's a bad word, because we've taught kids to be colorblind. And we don't live in a colorblind society. We live in a white and Black world. And because we live in my opinion, a world that's racist. There are racists in society, which you can decide, or you can decide that we live in a racist society. And based on what I've hopefully shared with you today, you will really think what the answer to that question is based on your own position. But I have in my own decided way of scholarship and discussion, we live in a place that race is real. It may not, some of it may be intentional, some of it may be unintentional. But we don't also, and when we look at gender, we've brought into fearing Black men and thinking that men are undeserving of benefits and undeserving of citizenship and personhood. And therefore we've created a hierarchy of who's deserving and undeserving. there was an article in 2015 about Black dads are doing best of all. And there was a study out of the CDC that talks about the fact that Black men are the most engaged men of all fathers with their kids. Now, people may not agree with that on their individual experience, but on a collective experience, Black men are very engaged. And I know in my own research, Black men are often who make very little money. And because they make very little money and their job prospects are very little, they're often the caretaker of their child. And that saves a lot of money around childcare. They're often the person who is doing minimal other types of, who are going to other activities. Now, they're not often allowed to do many things because our social welfare system or our social policy system doesn't engage men, but they are engaged. And Charles Blow, for those of you who know him, wrote about the fact that we don't talk about the Black dads based on a federal study, through a very large federal study through the CDC, are doing a really good job at being parents. Not perfect, but I know a lot of fathers who make lots of money who never talk to their kids. The other way that we provide services for men is only in two ways: through the corrections. Now, in corrections, men are guaranteed food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and access to legal services. It may not be the best, it may not be all of these all the time, but it's the one place where I know men get service. And the one thing that's sad about that is even some of the men that I study in my child support work will say to me, I'm about to commit a crime because it's getting cold, and they know what crime to commit so they can go to jail or go to prison because they don't have to deal with being in the cold and being homeless. And some of their friends are there. And so when we have a society where we have caused certain groups of men to feel that's the way to take care of themselves and that's okay, that's something we need to really re-examine. And I really would encourage, and I've said this to all social work schools that I talk to on an individual, that we need to really think about looking at how we think about men and women in the social welfare system, and specifically Black men, because we tend to think of welfare or any of these programs as Black, because disproportionately they aren't doing as well. The other way that we look at men and their contributions is through the child support enforcement system. And I know I only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to start winding down so we can have time for question and answers. But the child support enforcement system, which is connected, the one I'm talking about is not the one where you generally have a lawyer on either side and you're divvying up your assets. But this is a system where if the person has received a state cash benefit like TANF, temporary assistance to needy families, or they used to receive AFDC, they have to assign their child support rights to the state, and they have to cooperate and help the state locate where this man is so they can be reimbursed. Now, in the state where I live in, we had a project for over 10, 11 years where the mother received every bit of money that the father paid, whether she was on welfare or not, the mother got it. Right now, we're at 75% of that. In a state like Michigan, if I'm not mistaken, the mother will get, I think, up to $50 of that amount. So states can decide how they want to handle that. I know that, let's see where we are. There's a variety of also, let me go back. There's also a variety of things that child support does if you don't cooperate. They will take your driver's license, your hunting license in Wisconsin. They put a liens on your credit score, your credit reporting is down, and they will incarcerate you, which is what I was well known for in my initial work with the child support system. And my scholarship as my dissertation, but also more recent work I've done focuses on the whole idea of incarceration. And I told a story of the reason I went back to school. I was a 16-year practicing social worker. And in my 16th year, in my 15th year of a project I was doing, I was looking at paternity establishment and child support. I was running a policy project. And I wanted to know, where did men who weren't married get paternity established at? And I learned, and people have heard this already, but some of you haven't, I learned that if you were not married in Chicago and you wanted to get paternity established, you went to the bastard court. And the bastard court was in the basement of the police station on 23rd in Michigan in Chicago. And I just thought I said, that can't be true. I said, I know, and my wife's an attorney, and I said to my wife, I said, they call the kids bastards. And she said, yeah, that's legal. You can do that. That's legal. That's a legal term. And I said, but this is 1993. This is not 1776. but it's a legal term. So people were operating on a daily basis in 1993, calling children bastards and saying because they were unmarried. And I went through this process just to see what it was like. I was married. Didn't have any out of wedlock children, but I wanted to see, as a person trying to understand the system, and so you walk into the police station, they ask for your ID. So if you have something on your record, they're going to lock you up immediately. So why would you go get paternity established and try to do the right thing, as they would say? So I found that to be very offensive, and I had enough money in my program to hire attorneys. And I hired an attorney, three attorneys, as a matter of fact, and we sued the state, and we won. And that no longer exists. As of 1994, they were no longer allowed to call the children bastards. And I didn't do, all I did was gave the information and supported it and paid their time to do it. And they had to provide equal to what the parents who were middle class and above were receiving, which was childcare and mental health services and mediation services to this class of people as well. Now, the thing about that is I left there in 95, but they didn't officially make it where both those who are unmarried and married couples receive the same services until 2017. It took 25 years for that process to become a reality. And I followed it to see what happened. And it's the Comerford v. Gomez case, if you want to look it up. But that's the one thing. Now, my name is nowhere to be seen, but it shows the power of being a social worker who adheres to their values of non-judgmental, social justice, and racial equity. That's what I was trained in at U of D in the social work school. That's what I was trained to do. And I remember my teacher, Mrs. Ellington, being someone who really pushed that in my head, that you had to make a difference in people's lives. And that whether that meant you getting diapers for somebody, getting them access to food, or changing policy, which I to this day am very proud of. The other thing is that when you look, so the two programs are in corrections and child support, where we see most men, and in both spaces, it impedes their economic opportunity. And the reason child support is such a major discussion in our country is this amount of money that's owed to the child support agency, which is the 4D system of $150 billion. It's real. It's a real amount that's owed, that's not just actual dollars, but it's interest that's compounded. It's other fees as well. And in Michigan right now, it's $4 billion is owed to the state. And of that $4 billion, 10 of dollars is 1 billion. And this is data I picked up in September, that it comes out annually every year. So these dollars are real, but those who are poor and owe this money, if the mother is poor, the father's generally poor too, and they don't have the money, and they were going to use a system that was going to help them raise their children the best they could. So to me, it's causing more harm, even though I understand what they're trying to do. And most fathers I know, if they have money, they're going to make sure their kids get money. But we tend to think of men in social services is that we will either ignore them as if they really weren't there, or we'll go looking for him, which is a good thing, and we try to support him, or we make assumptions about his presence about there. But we generally don't really go out of our way. And the other place where I see this happening, and it's unfortunate, is in the child welfare system. I know that both of these systems, child support and child welfare, have a very significant incentive system. So you have an incentive to get paternity established and establish a child support order. But in child welfare, the system has an incentive to have a person placed. And they often don't consider the father as a placement, or they say they can't find the father. But I think if they ask the child, I bet they would find them then, because most of the kids I've talked to, not all the time, but most times know where their daddy is. And I'm not saying every daddy is perfect, and I get sometimes annoyed that I have to always make these apologies, but we live in a space where we don't understand that he's not hiding, he's really in plain sight. He's involuntarily removed, because if he is around, she loses benefits, and he wants her to have the benefits she needs because he can't provide them. And this country says they have a social welfare system to do that. Or they think he's apparently uninterested, and some of them are. And some of them are uninvolved. But to make the assumption that all Black men are the same is problematic. And I think social work can do a better job in that. And also the fatherhood services, we tend to also look at Black men when we provide them services is only in the terms of fatherhood, and that's only generally funded by child support, who wants them to be employed so they can get money. That's my very quick analysis of that. We can always have another talk with me on child support, only on child support. But when you talk about who's deserving and undeserving, in some ways, we perpetuate harm that we don't need to be perpetuating. One of the ways I've tried to, in my own other life, do is I've had a center, a public policy center that was initially funded by the Ford Foundation that I ran for 25 years. This is the first year that I didn't have anybody work there. I haven't worked there directly for at least 10 years, but I've kept it going through fundraising. But the purpose of this center was to look at what is the relationship between child support, domestic violence, and welfare for Black men in particular. There's a plethora of information and publications that we created over time. One of our very last and very cooperative funders was the Kellogg Foundation in Michigan, who we were very grateful to. So if you want information more on child support and what are some of the challenges for men, I would definitely send you there. Lastly, and before I go into some closing statements, I think if we're looking at welfare policy and practice, particularly as it pertains to creating a space for Black men to be deserving, is to look at social justice as something that we embrace, because when one of us do well, I think we all do well, and not to silo people if at all possible, to provide more holistic family policy, and to really provide economic opportunity and security for everybody, because that's what's needed for you to maintain your families. One thing I wanted to end with is this statement here. I don't know how many people have been to the museum in DC, is that this as you enter the museum in DC, this is what you see. The lives and labor of enslaved African Americans transformed the United States into a world power, yet they received no recognition or payment for what they created. By 1860, 4 million enslaved people produced well over 60% of the nation's wealth, and the slave trade valued them at $27 billion. Selling an enslaved person proved ready cash, explaining in part why roughly 600,000 people were sold in the domestic slave trade. This vast wealth in human capital affected the entire nation. This is data from our federal government. This is me. When you go into that Crown building right next to the Washington Monument, this is greeting you, telling you this is what the contribution of Black Americans, Black people were, yet they are not seen in the same way, are not given their full citizenship, and the hierarchy of race is perpetuated, and the truth is not told often. In the book 400 Souls, we recognize Blackness in skin tone. We recognize Blackness in unemployment rates, poverty rates, school suspension rates, arrest rates, and life expectancy. Despite this deep tradition of racial hierarchy and racial exclusion built into the American system, capitalist expansion always worked at the cross purpose to the goal of racial and cultural homogeny. In other words, as the United States expanded, the demand for labor almost always trumped the social desire to maintain racial purity. So when we look at race, it definitely is a deciding factor. When we look at Black men, we often don't give them their due diligence of what they've done in terms of really being involved or being denied the same services. When we look at certain neighborhoods and certain communities, people behave in ways that they behave because they haven't been afforded the same opportunities, the same, or even being able to have the same dreams. And I often think about the slaves that were here, the enslaved people who were here, that they must have been living under some kind of Afrofuturism or something, because they must have been looking at some point, we're not going to be in this same tormented space. And we're going to be in a space where people who look like me are going to be professors and doctors and teachers and social workers and electricians and carpenters and school teachers and parents. And it's just because when you see all of the negatives that were given to them, you have to wonder whether Black lives do matter. And right now, this is the chant we hear. hopefully we'll get to appreciate the fact that the cumulative effects of poor education, poor housing, poor healthcare, poor government service has created a bifurcated society that leaves more than its children behind. I'm going to end there and thank you for listening to me. And for all of you who came out today, I'm very impressed with the over 260 people. This is amazing. And here's my email if you want to talk to me further. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pate. That was amazing. And I know if you were watching the chat, some of the comments, people are very enthusiastic about your talk. So I'm not going to take up any more time, but Chantalea, do you want to start with the questions?
Sure, and I want to also offer my thank you to Dr. Pate for providing us with those surprising revelations about the history of Black people in America and how that translates to the experiences of African-American men. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So we just have a few questions. Some were provided to us before the session, and then we have others that were sent to us via the chat. I'll start with the easier one first.
Okay, good.
Can you re-recommend the book or hold up the book again that you recommended earlier in the session so
Yes.
folks can write that down?
Well, I have a couple, but the one that I would recommend highly is 400 Souls. Yes. 400 Souls is written by Kendi, Kendi, and Blaine, Blain. It's a community history of African America, 1619 to 2019. It's a phenomenal read. And again, I'm not a reader by no means. Talk to anybody, they'll tell you. Even my classmates who I know are here from my graduate school days. But it's a really good, easy read. And it's also a read. It's also a book that you can listen to that is really good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat that looks at minimum wage. The
Yes.
question says, is the refusal to raise minimum wage supporting slavery?
Well, I don't know if we can make the direct connection. I think it's a neoliberal idea that, you know, the market will take care of itself and those who make all the money will have that money trickle down. And I don't think that's, well, I'm still waiting for it to trickle down to some of my family so I can get a break. But it's not real. I don't know if I can connect it to slavery. I do think that, you know, even I'm doing a history book right now with someone at school, and we were interviewing people who work for us in our school, and they haven't seen a minimum wage, they haven't seen a wage increase in 15 years. So I do think the less we value those who are working in the service world, the less opportunity they get to have more of a economically secure life. And I think that's all on us to just keep requesting that people get treated with fair wages and fair opportunities. So I don't know if I would connect it directly to slavery. I more likely would connect slavery to those who are incarcerated and getting 7 cents an hour or whatever the amount of money is. But this particular one here, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not scholarly enough or haven't studied enough to say that's the direct track to agree.
Thank you for your honesty there.
You're welcome.
A question that was submitted earlier is related to encouraging African-American men to pursue social work. So we wanted to know if you had any tips or ideas for us who are working in the School of Social Work as a way for us to encourage African-American men to pursue social work as a way to give them voice related to social justice.
Well, you know, I went into social work with my own ideas of saving the world and not thinking about the money because I was so, you know, as a kid, we didn't have a whole bunch of money. So I figured getting a college degree or any degree would be giving me the money I would need to take care of my family. And it did. But again, I had to go back to school to even make it even more secure because that's one of the realities of our, because social work does not pay the wages it should pay. And unfortunately, this goes to our whole defining of masculinity and manhood. Men are given, the reality is men are paid more than women. And social work is seen as one of those fields that, and not seen, it is a field that's predominantly female, and is seen as one of those pink jobs, as they call it, which I hate that term, but that's what they call it. And therefore, it's hard for men who, if you're adhering to the definition of manhood, however that's defined, and if you're the one that's going to be the head of household, as to how that's defined, you probably wouldn't choose social work as your field. But if you decide that this is something that I want to do, and I'm willing to not have as much money as my counterparts, because we tend to, as again, without wealth and capital, you don't have as much freedom. Now you have some freedom and capital that's attained through social work as a degree, but I think that's the issue that social work is problematic for them, is that it's the fact that they're fighting against very sexist ideas of how we define manhood, and how people, and also unfortunately how some people just don't see beyond the fact that they can be more engaged in a way with people that is okay, and you don't have to make a lot of money, but that's just the way people are defined. They define themselves by the amount of money they make, and that's fine for them. I'm probably not answering. You see, I'm tripping over this question answer, because it's hard. It's a hard one, though, and it's hard and it's simple. Men want to make money. Men are not as intimate in this. This is so being a social work requires a level of intimacy that many men are not taught, and many men can't handle, and that's the reality. It's not a position. It's not something for everybody. I think it's a good. I've enjoyed it, obviously. But many men can't handle the intimacy of what it means to be a social worker. And it's seen as a women's field. And unfortunately, we don't treat women with the same respect as we treat men. That probably didn't answer your question, but that's the best I could do today.
No, well, you being here, and I know we have students on our cause, so you being an example for us in the field is answer in and of itself. Okay. So they can see the representation.
Thank you.
Our next question here is, how can schools of social work participate in advocacy to change or alter the notion of deserving at the individual and systems level?
That's a good question. People who teach in schools of social work got to do a better job. They have to be conscious of race, gender, and class. We have to do better. I don't know. I as a chair of a department, I've seen things I didn't realize that social work trains how to train students. I get very upset when we have diversity classes, and diversity classes is us talking about each kind of race, but not really talking about race. And we think that if you're servicing a Black family, you make sure you have collard greens and a daishiki. Not saying that's what my school does, but it comes down to these very simple ways of looking at race, when I want people to be just as knowledgeable as I am about how race was codified in this country, how race was structured in this country, and how we need to understand that we all don't have the same level playing field, that we all have, there's some people who have a much harder way, they can't cut a break because society has put them in a place where they're not seen as deserving. And I don't think we ever think about deserving, which is problematic as well. I don't think we often adhere to the issues of the ethics of social work. That's something I think needs to be challenged by more social work schools. But the whole idea of advocacy, and I tell my students this all the time, you can be the best. I think so many social workers should go into, not some of them shouldn't, but I think there's a lot of social workers who should be in politics, because you've seen the worst that people can be treated, or the worst outcomes that people could have. And you know that information better than most people in this country. And if there's anyone who can talk about what we need to do, it's a social worker. And so you could be engaged just by writing letters. You could be engaged by protesting. You could be engaged. The one thing I don't like about my school, and I tell this to my students all the time, they need to advocate for themselves. Now, of course, as chair, I don't want to have to hear it. I don't want to have to write a letter. I don't want to have And I'm not saying for Dean Kubiak, you guys should do that. But I know the one thing that I get so upset about is I could do anything and they'll be happy with it. And it just drives me crazy. And I wish sometime they would give me a little bit of chutzpah, that they would give me a little bit of fight. Because you're at a space in your life, you're at a time in your life where you can do that. And I remember even in grad school with my fellow people who were students with me, we would sit on the lawn or sit in some place. I remember we protested apartheid, and that just seemed like a natural thing to do. Where now I don't know whether the students are scared or nervous but they don't really, at least in my school, they don't do as much as I would like them to, but I think students should recognize their agency as students and not just accept yes as an answer all the time. Now, I know that's not probably what I should say but I do think there's a way to test out your role as an advocate by looking at your own school, but also looking at what's around you and just saying it's not acceptable. And there's a variety of ways of doing that.
I will just say that I will applaud that answer. And I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do with students over the last few years is acquaint them with the history of activism that the School of Social Work at Wayne State has, because it's such a rich history that had national implications. And yes, you're right. Sometimes it can be a double-edged sword, but I think that level of activism is definitely needed at this time in our history. Yep. Sorry to interject there.
No. I think what's really important here is that we're at a time in our history where people should think big. I mean, even if you don't think it's going to work, you should think big because people are listening. I mean, we have a Congress and we have we have people in positions that are different. I mean, transgender woman was just appointed yesterday, and a Black woman's in charge of housing, and a Native woman's in charge of I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Like who would have thought? 5 months later, we're in a different Congress and the administration looks so different. So think big. I mean, and I think students need to do it more than anybody because you're going to be around longer than I'm going to be around. So I think you need to start planning it for you when you're going to be in my space. You want something to look different.
Did we lose Dr. Pate?
No, I'm here.
No, it was
okay,
a short delay.
Oh, good. Okay, Chantal, sorry.
No problem. Here's a question, perhaps thinking big. Do you believe that reparation would help or is our best hope in closing the wealth gap?
Well, another book I'm gonna recommend is from here. It's called From Here to Equality. It's by William Darity and Christian Mullen. I'm someone who had some apprehension and I didn't fully understand the reparations ideal. I think reparations, the way they present it in this book, is definitely a point of discussion. And it will probably be one of the books, this book and 400 Souls will probably be books that I require in my social welfare policy class when we look at social welfare policy in an alternative way for a graduate class, particularly for my graduate class, maybe not for my undergrad class. Mm-hmm. I do think reparations is something to be considered. I mean, Evanston, Illinois, which is nearby me, is the first city to think about reparations for African Americans in the city, in the country. I'm not sure how it's going to work exactly, but I think that those are the type of bold experiments that we need to think about. And again, when I talk about the fact that some people had 400 plus years to get to where they are, and others have only had really, to be honest, 60 years because the Civil Rights Act and FHA loans weren't really available until 1960s for Black people in a different way than they were for white people. I think that we need to relook at how to bring people to a place where they may not be exactly equal, but they're a little bit closer to where they're in the same space as their counterparts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to say that Evanston was so interesting in how that I read anyway, that it's, I think, up to $20,000 loans for housing improvements.
Yes.
And you had to demonstrate that you were in the city when the zoning laws were all in fact, but I thought it was such a unique and creative way to go about it. But I also understand there's a lot of controversy
Yes.
about.
And the reason they're able to do it is because of their marijuana money. That's why they're able to do this in Illinois. I mean, so there's some benefit to that, I guess. But I mean, there is some benefit to that. But it's interesting. You have to have that money somewhere to be able to do that. So maybe every state should legalize marijuana, and then we'll be able to give everybody reparations. I don't know. That's a controversial statement. I'm sure I'll get in trouble with.
Well, unfortunately, Michigan has, but that we haven't done much creative with the money.
Oh,
so yeah,
that's an interesting study. Like, why haven't they?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're still with blinders on around it. I don't think it was a popular choice. So
you know, in states like Colorado, who is the legalized marijuana, they now do full pass-through for their child support. They don't have that same worry about where we're going to get the money from if we're giving out money to people for benefits. How now they just say, we'll give it all. If you pay your money, we'll give it all to the mother. And they're much more lax on incarceration or any of those other penalties that are directed at men or non-custodial parents who also are women. So, I mean, there's a way for this to work because it's just a matter of capitalists. This whole idea of capitalism and the neoliberal policies that we have implemented, they can work to some extent to reduce the strain and stress on poor parents, but we have to kind of be creative. We have to think about, let's see how we can do it so everybody benefits, if at all possible. Yeah. Is there any other questions?
We have lots, but we won't have time to get to them. But I want to thank my colleagues for the engaging chat and the additional questions that are being asked in the chat. But our last question, as a Black man and a scholar and an expert in your field, do you believe you have achieved even a small portion of what we call this American dream?
Oh, definitely. I think I've been privileged to. I mean, I've had a privileged life, even when as I get older and reflect on what I've been able to do. I've had a good education. I've had a loving wife, a wonderful family kids have gone to college. I have a beautiful home. So the things that my requests are very simple. I would like a nicer car, but the car works, and that's my social work side. I don't want to be spending a whole. I would like to have some of the cars that some of my fraternity brothers have, but I just don't have that. I don't have that swagger. They have a lot more swagger than me. But I mean, the one thing though, I feel I don't get to enjoy it in the same way though as my counterparts, because I have to see Black death around me all the time. I have to see people who look like me asking for money on the corner more than them. I have to, there's just things that I see that I'm as a researcher who does qualitative work, I've never stopped doing the research I'm doing. I'm always looking at how people interact and what's going on around me. And I'm always collecting notes in my head about my next research project, or what do I want, what is valuable to me, or what do I believe in? And so the thing that pains me the most is that I see people who look like me who just will never have the same opportunity as me. And they're smarter than me, like way smarter and way more ingenious and way more creative. But I got the dice was rolled and I was able to have the life I have. And I know people get mad at me about saying I was very lucky, but I'm very lucky. I'm extremely lucky because I was a kid who, just for something, I was a kid who was homeless for part of my life. When I was 10 years old, we lost our house and I was on the street with my mom and 3 brothers, and we slept in the park. And then we found one of our family members took us in, and who would have thought I would be a professor giving a lecture? That's weird to me. It's even weird today. I was thinking, what am I doing? What I'm saying, they don't even quite care about. I have low self-esteem, as you can see.
Well, if you see the chat, our colleagues are applauding you for your work, and we're lucky that you joined us today. So thank you for this Q&A with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Dean Kubiak to close us out.
Thank you so much, and nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too.
David, I can't tell you, I know we talked earlier, and I am mourning the fact that we're not physically together and that we had to wait a year. But let me tell you, your year of preparation for this talk has definitely been our benefit, because I know it would have been fantastic last March, but the depth and the knowledge that you have and that you've provided to us, I can't thank you enough for. I can't begin to tell you how much just your words have meant to me, and I know our community. This is really important to us in Detroit, and being a school of social work in Detroit. And I do think that you're exactly right, that it is the time, it is the moment, and we can't let our guard down. We've been in a very dark place, and we know what is possible if we let our guard down. We've got to keep moving towards the light and towards this change. And I think you have so brilliantly laid that out for all of us. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I know this is not the last time that you're going to be in Detroit, and we're going to bring you back physically so we can have that dinner together and we can meet in person. But I just thank you from all of us. This has been a wonderful, wonderful talk. And
well, thank you so much again. I wanted to say hello to one of my friends who was on here. I think Austin is on here, who gave me some support before I got on. So I want to say hello to Austin, and I think my daughter's on here as well, and several of my friends, and I know several of my fraternity brothers. And I saw a couple of them told me get a nice car. But it's just so nice. It's just, I really am just so honored that they even want to hear me talk. So thank you again for inviting me. It's been a wonderful opportunity, and if I can, when we get to see each other face to face, I look forward to that dinner as well.
yes, and if I remember correctly, your fraternity brothers had also organized something for you when you were going to be here last March.
Yes,
so
they were going to, yes, it was very nice.
yeah.
So now I'll fake that after this. I'm gonna go meet them after this. So I'll fake it like it was going to be happening.
Well, next time when you come in person, we're going to let them know so they also can roll out the red carpet. So
thank you again. Thank you to everybody. It's been a wonderful experience, and much luck to Wayne State, and go Warriors.